Literary Modernism, and a look into A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. First, I will talk about the rise of the modernist novel, and then the characteristics of modernist literature. Then I will introduce James Joyce, the 20th century Bildungsroman, and then a brief look into A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now, the rise of the modernist novel. Modernist authors published as early as the 1880s and into the mid-1940s. During this period, society at every level underwent profound changes. British and European writers who began writing in the 1890s transformed the 19th century most characteristic literary genre, which was the realist novel. They turned from objective modes of description to stream of consciousness and other subjectivist techniques. Literary historians have frequently treated these changes as the result of a turning inward, or a rejection of the social concerns of 19th century realism. Most critical studies on literary modernism begin by discussing the predominant worldview held by intellectuals during the period just before World War I. Now, the generation of artists who had been born in the 1880s and early 1890s came of age during the first decade of the 20th century, and they were coming to terms with a world that had changed dramatically in terms of religious, economic, and political realities. Now, there are many theorists and thinkers who affected the modernist movement, such as Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. Now, Darwin's ideas had called into question the place of human beings within the cosmos. Concepts such as survival of the fittest and chance interfered with the ability of writers and thinkers to assume that the universe had an order, or a morality that was based upon the divine origin of the species. And for Karl Marx's economic theories, they called into question the moral legitimacy of the middle class, and they laid out in the open the proposition that social structures were the result of ideologies that could be changed and questioned. And Sigmund Freud introduced the idea that all of reality is subjective, and it is based on the play of basic drives. Now, there are many novelists who shaped the formal techniques of modernism, such as Joseph Conrad, James Joyce, and Marcel Proust. They attempted, through their literary experiments, to redefine the model of national belonging that they had inherited from 19th century liberalism. Now, the literary form of modernism, and especially high modernism, was at its height from 1900 to 1940, and many of the main authors and novelists of the time include William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Franz Kafka, and D.H. Lawrence. Now, what are the characteristics of modernist literature? So, early in the movement, literary modernists focused on two shifts: in form and in audience. Now, the shift in form happened in poetry, where the focus moved away from formal verse to free verse. And in fiction, the focus moved away from plot to an evocation of the internal lives of characters, what we would call now interiority. And the shift in audience happened because the reader was now increasingly expected to perform interpretive functions. Writers abandoned authorial intrusions and predictable and structured plot lines. Instead, writers developed what became known as fragmentary units, and they were often held together in ways that required the reader to intuit meaning. Now, let's talk about stylistic and thematic features of modernist literature. Modernist literature is known for having an open form, an absence of a central and heroic figure. It has a narrative that is disjointed and has overlapping voices. There can be multiple narrators. And there is a concern for larger factors such as social or historical change. Some thematic characteristics include stream of consciousness writing. Now, stream of consciousness aims to provide a textual equivalent to the stream of a fictional character's consciousness. It creates this impression that the reader is eavesdropping on the flow of conscious experience in the character's mind. There is also interior monologue, which presents a character's thought streams exclusively in the form of silent inner speech. It represents characters speaking silently to themselves and quotes their inner speech, often without speech marks. And it is presented in the first person, and also it attempts to mimic this unstructured free flow of thought. Now, who is James Joyce? James Joyce was born in Ireland in 1882. He was a novelist and a poet. Now, Joyce was one of the pioneers of the stream of consciousness technique in novels and a new type of poetry called prose poem. He was one of the most influential writers in the modernist avant-garde of the early 20th century. In 1914, he published his first book, Dubliners, which was a collection of 15 short stories, and in 1916, he published his second book, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now, the context within which Joyce was writing is important, because at the beginning of the 20th century, Ireland was a nation that was struggling to shake off the impact of colonial rule. And what complicated the situation in Ireland was the fact that the Catholic Church was very powerful and had often been complicit in the political schemes that kept reform from succeeding. Now, when Joyce came of age in the early years of the 20th century, he certainly could have joined what became known as the Irish literary revival, but he chose not to do so. Joyce, being a Catholic, he was just as eager as most Irish Catholics to have an independent Irish state. But by the time he reached adulthood, he viewed most social institutions with great distrust. He felt that the church, the government, regardless of who was in charge, and the educational system were all allied against the work of a true creative intellect. And he refused to join or to support any endeavor that asked his allegiance, because Joyce felt that his first and only allegiance was to art. And in this view, he was joined by many of the leading literary modernists. Now, what is the 20th century Bildungsroman? Now, the Bildungsroman is a literary genre that focuses on the psychological and moral growth of the protagonist from childhood to adulthood, also known as coming of age. The term Bildungsroman is a German term coming from the words Bildung, which means education, and Roman, which means novel. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a Kunstelroman, which is viewed as a subcategory of the Bildungsroman. A Kunstelroman is an artist novel, and it is a narrative about the development or coming of age of an artist. Now let's have a brief look into A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It is the first novel of James Joyce. It is a Kunstelroman written in a modernist style, and it traces the religious and intellectual awakening of young Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's fictional alter ego, whose surname alludes to Daedalus, who is a craftsman from Greek mythology. Now, Stephen questions and rebels against the Catholic and Irish conventions under which he has grown, culminating in his self-exile from Ireland to Europe. Now, The Portrait of the Artist, as I've mentioned, is an artist novel, which is a Kunstelroman, and it is narrated in third person. Now, although most of the novel is in the third person, the point of view is Stephen's. So as Stephen develops as a person, the language and perspective of the narration develop with him. We see everything in the manner in which he thinks and feels it. At the very end of the novel, there is a brief section in which the story is told through Stephen's diary entries. That section is in the first person. Now, for the structure of the novel, it is separated into 5 chapters, each chapter depicting the artist's struggle, first to master his environment and then to free himself from it. Now, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man takes place in Ireland at the turn of the century. Young Stephen Dedalus comes from an Irish Catholic family, and it is a story of him gradually deciding to cast off all his social, familial, and religious constraints. Now, Stephen Dedalus goes through many changes in life, and this is a brief categorization of his major life events. First, we have a struggle with identity, where Stephen feels isolated and alone. He struggles to decide whether he should be loyal to his family, his church, his nation, or his vocation as an artist. Now, next phase is the excess of carnal lust, where Stephen has an encounter with a prostitute and starts to live a life of sin and debauchery. The next phase is a life of excess penitent piety, where after a life of sin and debauchery, he had an emotional reaction to a priest's sermon on hellfire, and that led to his temporary devotion to religious life. And then when he's asked to join the priesthood, Stephen realizes that he must confront the decision of whether to center his life around religion or art. Then Stephen decides to reject the religious life in favor of the life of an artist. He resolves to live his life to the fullest and vows not to be constrained by the boundaries of his family, his nation, and his religion. And after Stephen is enrolled in University College Dublin, Stephen gradually forms his own theory of aesthetics. Stephen also imagines his escape from Ireland as something that is parallel to the flight of Daedalus, who escaped from his prison with wings crafted by his own genius. And the book ends with Stephen developing his own aesthetic theory and leaving Ireland to pursue the life of a writer. Now, one of the most important quotes from the book include this, where Stephen says, "I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself home, my fatherland, or my church. And I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning." Here we can finally see that Stephen demonstrates a very clear understanding of who he is and what he wants. He's defined by his artistic goals and by his ambition of pursuing the life of an artist and abandoning his life in Ireland. And then these are the final lines of the novel, where Stephen says, "I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." Now these final lines proclaim Stephen's aim to be an artist for the rest of his life, and to create a work that has never been done before from the smithy of his soul. That means that he strives to be an artist whose consciousness is the essence of his art. Now this is a declaration that could stand as a motto for many of the novelists of Joyce's day.